All right, I would like to call this special school board meeting to order. Will you call the roll, please, Clerk Sandsted?
Certainly. I'm on the wrong page. Hang on. You gave me a chance to organize, and then I didn't. Do I have a roll sheet on the other side? Is it you attached the... With a flag marked attendance. Thank you very much.
I'm glad it even happens to
Member Gorham.
board members.
We're all glad that this is this meeting instead of a usual one. Okay. Chair Kirby.
Here.
Member Loeffler-Kemp.
Here.
Member Lofald.
Here.
I am Member Oswald.
Here.
I am here. Member Trinka.
Here.
Superintendent Gronseth.
Here.
Assistant Superintendent Starzecki. Deputy Clerk Hassler is excused from this, I imagine.
Yes.
Secretary Dolans. And Secretary Thibault excused. And our student representatives are also excused. We have a quorum, Chair.
Thank you. All right. We are here to discuss resolution. Can't find the number of it. E3-1835-33. Member Gorham, can you read that resolution? Do you have it there?
Yeah, just a moment.
Oh, sorry.
So many electronics involved.
Whereas pursuant to Minnesota Statute Section 13D.05, Subdivision 2A3, a public body must close a meeting for discussion of private educational data. Now therefore, be it resolved by the School Board of Independent School District 709, St. Louis County, Minnesota, that the school board shall meet in executive closed session on March 27, 2018, at approximately 4:15 p.m. in the board conference room of historic Old Central High School for the purpose of discussion of private educational data. I move resolution E3-1835-33.
Second.
It's moved by Member Gorham, seconded by Member Oswald. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Then that passes, and we will recess to private closed session. Recessed to that. All right. Reconvene. All right, thank you, Board. I would like to reconvene the executive closed session regarding private educational data. And I will read Resolution E3-18-35-34. Whereas written notice of intent to expel a student attending East High School was served upon the student and the student's parent, whereas the notice of intent to expel the student complied with the provisions of the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act, Minnesota Statute 121A47, Subdivision 2, whereas the student's parent signed a waiver of rights to hearing and appeal, whereas the student's parent consented to the expulsion of the student for 1 full year, 12 months, from the effective date of the expulsion, and whereas under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, the name of the student proposed for expulsion is private data, now, therefore, be it resolved as follows. Number 1, the school board hereby expels the student from the schools of Independent School District number 709 Duluth for 1 full year, 12 months from the effective date of expulsion, March 27, 2018 through March 26, 2019. Number 2, the superintendent or his designee is directed to mail to the student and the student's parent a copy of this resolution along with a letter stating that the student has been expelled and that the student has the right to re-enroll in the district on March 26, 2019. Number 3, the student or his designee, the superintendent or his designee, is directed to identify the alternative educational services that are available to the student during the period of expulsion if the student wishes to take advantage of them. Number 4, the superintendent or his designee is directed to make an electronic report of this expulsion to the Commissioner of the Department of Education within 30 calendar days as required by Minnesota Statute 121A.53. I move Resolution E3-18-35-34. Is there a second? Seconded by Member Gorham. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of Resolution E3-18-35-34, say aye. Aye. Opposed? It passes unanimously.
Move to adjourn.
There's a move to adjourn. Is there a second? Seconded by Member Trinka. Any discussion? All in favor of adjourning, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Then we are adjourned for this executive closed session. Thank you. And, now I would like to call to order the special school board meeting on the provisional budget. Will you call the roll, please, Member Sandsted?
Certainly. Member Gorham.
Present.
Chair Kirby.
Here.
Chair Loeffler, Member Loeffler-Kemp.
Here.
Member Lofold.
Here.
Member Oswald.
Here.
I am here. Member Trenka.
Here.
Superintendent Gronseth.
Here.
Assistant Superintendent Starzecki. Deputy Clerk Hassler.
Here.
Secretary Dolans. Secretary Thibault. And our student representatives are excused. We do have a quorum, Chair.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is public comment, and I will note that there was a little bit of a disgruntlement, I called it last time, so I'm going to ask that speakers limit their comments to 3 minutes, and not that we will have a trapdoor there, but we'd like people to limit that to 3 minutes. So that being said, I would call Ann Square Brown, who's the first person there. Welcome. Let me make sure I turn on the right. There you go.
Thank you. Good evening, and I'm impressed to see you all here yet another night out of the week. Thank you for your commitment to the education of our kids. My name is Ann Square Brown, and I represent the Community-Based School Equity Initiative, and we wanted to come before you just to say we applaud and are grateful for budget options that help us move forward towards equity. And while not 100% of the compensatory education funding is directed towards the achievement gap, it seems like a really significant shift in approach. It provides all schools with money to address achievement gap in a targeted way. We wanted to let you know that we've reviewed the budget options, and option A2 is a stronger move towards equity and the one we encourage you to support. It seems that key to seeing if this truly impacts the achievement gap will be how schools use the discretionary compensatory education funding provided, and that everyone who's committed to equity and reducing the achievement gap can be grateful that we are moving in such a positive direction. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak at this time? Yes.
A little late.
That's fine. Welcome.
I was taking kids to swim lessons. Good evening, Superintendent Gonsa.
I'm sorry, can you state your name?
My name is Jen Rogers.
Thank you.
School board members, thank you for your time tonight and thank you for listening. My name is Jen Rogers. I'm here tonight representing Congdon Park Elementary PTA. But first and foremost, I am a mother. 2 of the 3 are at Congdon. One of them is receiving special education services. I also sit on the board of the citywide PTSA, the Parent Teachers Association, whose goal is to envelop and support all of the children of the district. I grew up in Central Hillside. I went to 3 schools that are now all closed because of the Red Plan. I went to Chester Park, Woodland, and Central. And my husband and I moved here and bought my childhood home for my parents to raise our children here. We chose Duluth. I believe in this community. Also, its educational possibilities and its opportunity. What I can tell you about Congdon is that not every child in the east side of Duluth is successful. Some struggle with homelessness and home insecurity with little to no mental health services to mitigate this trauma. There is economic instability visible in the 150 children at Congdon that qualify for free or reduced lunches. And of our 613 students already have such large classroom populations that students can barely move desks around, much less deal with the physical and emotional constraints of so many students. More and more students are experiencing anxiety. I've gotten this information from our teachers. Because of the age of the school, our physical classroom space is smaller than most schools, 900 square feet on average, making increase in class sizes that much more impactful. And with the loss of this funding, we may lose as many as 3 teachers. We could actually see class sizes rise as high as 35. We need to find ways to decrease the impact of this loss of these funds. And I think I speak for the PTA and Congdon and even Lester Park that we are all waiting and watching. I do know that large class sizes will take a toll on our children's education. This is a fact. It has been studied and proven. You may not see it this minute, and it may not be on this year's test scores, but rest assured it will come. With the rise of children with developmental issues such as autism and emotional behavioral disorders not getting the support services that they truly deserve, how can a typical student be given the opportunity to excel? How can we expect our teachers to pick up this slack? I personally did not know that the compensatory Title I funds were being used to reduce class sizes. Certainly everyone that I have spoken with, PTA members, parents, teachers, were not aware. In reality, this has been a dirty trick on us. Taking money from Title I funding to make up for the financial deficit, even if the state board allowed you to do it, it puts us in an awful position looking like we are stealing money from underprivileged children when our intentions are nothing of the sort. I do understand how our achievement gaps can be pinpointed to haves and have-nots, But I ask those that disparage our school's intentions actually to come for a tour, to learn about our school before making assumptions about what we are or we aren't. A tour that I or my principal, our principal, would be happy to give. Isn't it time that we as a community stop using this labeled division and recognize that each child is an individual, all of them different and with different needs, and not defined where their physical body lands? How about we change the narrative, work to make connections between schools so we can be successful together? And I, for one, am on board. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? No one else has signed up? All right, thank you for those speakers. And we will then move on to the purpose of the meeting. Will someone read the resolution? Does it, Member Oswald, can you read our resolution?
Resolution, adoption of the preliminary budget report for the fiscal year 2019 budget. Be it resolved by the School Board of Independent School District Number 709, St. Louis County, State of Minnesota, that the preliminary budget report for the fiscal year 2019 budget, as presented to the school board, be adopted. In addition, the school board requests periodic updates as administration continues to finalize the fiscal year 2019. I move resolution B-3-18-3532.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Member Sandsted. Is there any discussion? Member Sandsted.
I think to start with, we need to frame this in that we're approving the preliminary budget report, and I'm not sure if that means this entire packet we've been given, which gives us several options and we're not choosing an option, or if we are here to choose an option and then that is actually what we are going to be approving as the preliminary budget report.
Superintendent.
Thank you. During the regular process of committee meetings and the regular school board, there were a couple of options that came forward. After those discussions and receiving feedback from principals and staff and community members, we have updated those options, and so you have two options before you tonight. Option A.2, which is really an updated version of A, and then option C, which is a different version. The main differences between the two, well, first off, some of the updates from the original options include a lower reduction of middle school, what we called referendum dollars. They're not from a referendum, but they used to be a referendum, but they've been maintained as an investment. The original piece of that was $200,000. It was reduced to $170,000, and the former options also had significant reductions in maintenance and changing cleaning schedules. And after receiving a lot of feedback on that item as well, we have gotten that down to one position that would not be filled, that is currently vacant, and we would not make reductions in the other areas of maintenance. The other piece is the base deficit amount, and that is, well, I think Mr. Hassler could address this as well, but the base deficit, as we looked at our original options, was $3.4 million. As we know, the state continually updates our documents, and when we look at enrollments, the state entered some enrollments on October 1st, and then In February, they updated those with our new enrollment numbers, and that translates to higher revenues for this school year. After making reductions mid-year, we have been watching every expenditure with with an eagle eye, and our expenditures are coming down below what we had originally projected as well. So revenues are above, expenditures are below. The difference is about $1.5 million. So we plan to end this school year with a meager but positive balance. So we won't have a deficit at the end of this year. There is, however, still a remaining deficit as we go into next year, that difference between our revenues and expenditures for next year, and that is that 1.6 million number for the base deficit. The main difference beyond that between these two options is the amount that is reinvested into specific school supports and strategies, and the amount of ratio shift that happens. And then there are the working budgets that go with each of those models, and what staffing could look like with each of those models, and that is shows you how many FTEs would be allocated to each building. And I'm sure there's more questions, and I know that there's been a few questions and some requests for some more information, and I'd be happy to share that if you want me to as well.
Member Sandstead, follow up?
Yes, so my question is as to the process.
Yes.
And I'm still not clear on what, if we voted in favor of this adoption of the preliminary budget report, that preliminary budget report would contain. Does it contain both options, or are we going to choose one option and then that shall be the preliminary budget report?
I'm sorry I dove in too deep there.
It's okay.
You are choosing an option or amending an option, but we are moving forward with one of these models upon a vote.
Thank you.
If there isn't agreement, then we would continue our work and schedule a later meeting.
Member Trinka.
Thank you. So I have a number of questions, and I'm not sure if it's appropriate to just share time and ask one at a time, or if you want me to just go with all of them.
Just start first.
Start first. Okay, good. So one of the questions that I have, and I have asked Mr. Hassler about this before, and I always use the wrong terminology, so I apologize again for not learning my lesson on that. But in terms of both projections, what type of financial wiggle room has been built in, recognizing that we need to financially forecast for an APU variance in the next year, and that had some really, how it was handled this last year had some really unfortunate ramifications on some of our really outstanding staff people, and I really want to make sure that we're learning from that lesson too.
Mr. Hassler.
Mr. Gronseth addressed the changes in the data assumptions that underlie our budget projections. The information that we're coming to you today with is the best information we have on expenditures year to date, revenues year to date, and assumptions about next year. Our assumptions about next year for revenue are based on enrollment projections that we believe are conservative, and we have grown this year in our enrollment, and that has been a tremendous positive for us. We would not be having the discussion we're having tonight about a previously anticipated deficit without the growth that we have in enrollment this year. But that growth in enrollment is inconsistent with our history in this school district for quite a number of years, and at the moment we do not believe that that justifies us anticipating continuation of growth. I will be really, really happy if we are wrong 2 or 3 years in a row about not anticipating growth and getting it. But until that point in time comes, I think it's prudent that we continue to be conservative as to our enrollment projections.
Yep, I would agree with that based on the history. I'm just curious, I think last year there was roughly $200,000 that was built in. I went from slush fund to wiggle room. I can't remember what the term here is.
We don't use that term.
Contingency funds.
Reserves.
And reserves, yeah, but contingency funds. Because a couple of things. I want to be careful, like I said earlier, that we're not in a situation in December where we're having, I don't want to repeat what happened last December. The other piece is I want to be really careful that if we're allocating compensatory education dollars in a certain way, that we're not then using that as a way to fund additional programs in the future if we move into a further financial deficit. So I'm just curious what dollar amount you are anticipating building in to that contingency.
I'd like to give you 2 answers to that. Number one, what dollar amount will we build into the budget for contingency? Approximately $300,000, which is consistent with what it has been in the past. But separate from the budget, and I think all the board is fully aware of this, separate from the budget, there is fund reserve. And we do not have fund reserve at this point in time. So that is cause for concern and cause, I think, for us to be as prudent as we can be in terms of our expectations of future revenue growth, and would also cause us, I think, to want to try to be conservative as to future expenditure commitments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Member Oswald.
Thank you. Thank you, Member Trinka, for the question about the contingency amounts. I was going to ask that, so I'm glad you did. And my other question, Mr. Hassler, is you say everything's a conservative enrollment amount or enrollment projections. If you were to all of a sudden be liberal in your amount, what do you imagine the top number of an enrollment projection be if we were going to roll the dice and hope for the best rather than be conservative?
We've grown in our enrollment this year approximately 100 students. Again, we're not projecting that going forward because that's just not been our history year to date. I would not advise you to base our budgets on an expectation of student growth at this time.
I wasn't planning on
Okay.
it. I was just asking, if this is conservative and we vote on this budget, do you feel that we may get extra dollars from extra bodies in our schools next year, be it 2 or 20? But I guess you're just being conservative, and that's okay. The other statement I needed to talk about was the special service cuts that are involved in both proposed budgets. I am very concerned knowing that our kids are needier and our staff are being overwhelmed, that both budgets propose cutting staff in that area, and we can't even hire enough staff. We have vacant positions that are open year-round to try to fill special services, and reducing the TOSAs that work there that are vital to training and overseeing and helping and managing our various IEPs and needs. I would certainly hope that that is something that we can work to bring the amount of change down in that category, because that elimination of staff people that work with special services are only going to increase classroom needs, plain and simple. And that's not okay if we are dealing with and grappling with, are we going to change class size ratios on top of that? I mean, there is a perfect storm brewing here if we constantly cut for those schools that don't have a lot of resources. They're not going to be able to cope. And so I would really like to see that number down. My comment about which option I'm supportive of, I believe I'm more in support of option C, and that is because it has less ratio shift, making more FTE available to everyone in the district. And if you want to think about Denfeld, it's a difference based on the chart that we've got. If Denfeld losing 2 teachers versus 1 teacher, I would much rather ensure that Denfeld has that 1 extra teacher that they would possibly lose with a 1.5 shift, and instead just lose the 1 that they can make up and buy back in whatever form needed with their compensatory education funds. It makes no sense to cut a budget and to approve a budget to cut FTE when your compensatory education is just going to replace that FTE. That doesn't make a lot of logical sense to me. It seems counterintuitive that you're going to buy back staff just to get back to the status quo. So I would like to hear more thoughts on that from my fellow board members, because that's where I go in my head, and I don't know if my thinking's off, but that's what I think about. So,
Superintendent, did you want to?
I just wanted to speak to the special education program reductions. A number of these reductions are not direct service reductions, and so some of them were specific materials budgets that had been in place that over time haven't been used at that level, and so we're reducing the budgets. Others are district level positions that we're providing some supports and no longer will be a reduction. There was a temporary clerical position that went unfilled, and that will continue as unfilled. But it's also increasing some of our third-party billing. And so it's actually increasing our revenues, which is it's increasing the amount coming in through third-party billing, and so it's actually reducing the cost of special services to general fund, and so that's a piece of it too. Sorry, thank you. There are some requests for reductions, position reductions from individual folks, but also with special services, we are responsive to specific students' needs. And so if we have students who require medical assistance, like they require an LPN or an RN's services, and then they move out of the district or they graduate and we no longer have that specific need, that shows up as a reduction in the budget because of that specific IEP's accommodations. And so there are a couple of positions, but I want to say probably more, about 3/4 of that are either district-wide budget items or specific reductions due to specific IEP needs.
Sure. Member Oswald?
Thank you for that clarification. It's really hard when you get a budget that reads TOSA reductions, specific PD, requested leaves unfilled, and staff reductions. It's great to have more answers to that, because that's where I went previously in my head as to what that meant. So thank you.
Member Gorham.
I'd like to ask about revenue generation, specifically with our school social workers. How does that happen?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Revenue generation with our school social workers. How can you talk about how that revenue is generated?
There are a couple of different ways. The main funding source for social workers in the district is through special education. That's about, we get about 60% of the funding. We also have third-party billing with our social workers, but not all of the duties that our social workers do are billable time. And so there are different districts who limit the services that social workers provide so that a greater percentage of their time is billable. However, that is something that we've had discussion about, but we also see the need for the services that they are providing. So the main sources are that third-party billing. If we were to change our service model, we could get a higher percentage of that back through third-party billing, and then special education is only for social workers who are working within our special services department. So anyone who works with general education students and families would be general fund. So there are, I wanted to clarify that because there are social workers who work specifically with students who receive special education services, and then some sites with discretionary funds hire social workers to work more on mental health and social emotional learning. And the roles are different.
I think when we're facing the circumstances we're facing and we have staff on board, I think it's always important to be thinking about having staff working up to their license. So I guess the question I'd have is are there some duties and tasks that our social workers are doing that other professionals may be doing that, say, enroll, while we have these individuals who are specially licensed who can generate funds, be in a position to be capturing more revenue and still providing the services all of our students need. Sounds like that conversation's happened, but I'm curious about it as a board member. Maximizing utilization of our staff and their skills.
Okay.
I don't think there was a question.
I guess, is there opportunity to explore that more, I guess, would be a question. How could we do that?
Is your question really?
Could we budget that?
Okay.
How long would it take?
Assistant Superintendent Starzecki has been working on this more specifically, and she was looking at me wondering if she was going to come up to the table and talk about this, but the short answer is yes, we could make some changes.
So it began about a year and a half ago, just talking about the opportunity for our school social workers to generate more revenue with the billable services. They currently do some services that are not billable, and so it will be a matter of taking a look at the roles and responsibilities across the special education department to identify if there are some opportunities to shift some of those duties within the department to other service providers, and it would be a plan that we'd need to put together with a variety of leadership, principals, and practitioners to kind of come up with what that plan looks like. I think that is something that could be pursued, and then there would need to be some data monitoring to make sure that we are increasing our billable services, and that revenue piece too would need to go along with that.
Can I do one follow-up on that?
Sure, that's got to do with that, yes.
Just a limited follow-up on that. Of the billable services that are provided now, are we fully billing as we should be in order to get third-party reimbursement for the services that we currently provide?
We are receiving far less revenue than we anticipated initially. I would say that the number one thing that I hear from our school social workers who work in special education is the amount of time it takes. The paperwork requirements are enormous, so other things would have to come off their plate. I think they're doing the best job that they can given the current model that we're working under, and I know it's on everybody's radar. I think it's a matter of really defining how do we make sure that we take some things off their plate if we are going to ask them to do that paperwork piece.
Member Lefler-Kemp.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, again for all the answers to our questions in the last week or two, and providing us with more additional information, Doug and Peggy and Bill. I have a couple questions. My first one has to do with the middle school referendum funding decrease, and I asked about this a couple weeks ago at our business committee as well. Can you kind of flesh this out a little bit more to better understand what the middle school funding currently is being used at Ordine and at Lincoln Park, and what the impact of the cuts there will be on the middle school programming? And kind of a third question just on that item is, what concerns have you heard from our two principals and their CITS teams around this decrease in funding?
It's my understanding that this funding is discretionary funding that is currently used to decrease class size. At least that is the case at Ordine East. At Lincoln Middle School, they have a little bit more flexibility because there are multiple sources of discretionary funding. So a portion of that is used for class size reduction, but may also be used for other strategies for supporting families, interventionists, or social emotional supports, and other decisions made by their CITs. Whenever we talk about making reductions, it's a concern because times, budgets are tight everywhere. And when we have been in reduction mode for probably the better part of 2 decades, things are getting pretty tight. So the original reduction amount that we had there was, as I said, $200,000 in the original budgets. That has been reduced to $170,000 in the latest models that you have. Peggy, I'm trying to remember what the whole amount was.
The full amount of the referendum was about $350,000, and some of that was allocated out as FTE, and then this $170,000 was additional funding that they could use as they saw for their needs. So this is only that additional funding piece, the discretionary portion. The FTE, the additional FTE is still in the budget.
My last part of that question was, what concerns have you heard from the two principals about this reduction?
Because they use it for reducing class size, their concern would be that class size would increase without this additional money to invest in it. So the 170, so about half of that would be for each of the middle schools.
Member Sandsted.
To start with an observation, it sure would be nice if we didn't have to use all these other funds to deal with class size. If the state would fund us fully,
that is general.
Sufficient.
That is general.
Yes. Well, one thing I wanted to get in was that I appreciate that both options take out any ratio shift for kindergarten, so that we're not exploring any sort of increase in our classroom sizes for kindergarten next year. I was at the roundup at Lowell last night. It was very fun. Lots of excited parents and kids. My question at this point is to better understand the difference in the options. put like this. For option C, how are the non-compensatory ed general funds distributed by building? Are they essentially equal proportional, or is there an unequal distribution of general fund to make up for class size differences?
There is a general education shift when that happens. When 10% becomes allocated to the site, that allocated amount then is freeing up general fund to fund the difference between that ratio, which goes district-wide. That is on the second line on page 9 that says amount needed to reach language of resolution 31,637. That is the amount needed to maintain the language of the resolution so that all sites receive at least 80% of their compensatory education. In this model, if we didn't make that investment of 31,000, there would be 2 sites that would fall slightly below the 80% mark. And so that further investment ensures that the resolution language is followed.
So by saying 10% of the 80% that's staying on site is going to FTE, we free up other general education dollars that are then distributed district-wide, but disproportionately away from sites that are receiving more compensatory education, because those sites that are generating have that 10% to cover FTE, whereas the sites that are not generating don't have much in that 10%, and so they're getting more general education dollars.
Yes.
In option A2, is there any disparity in the distribution of general fund dollars, excluding compensatory education dollars?
No.
Thank you.
Member Trinka.
Thank you for asking that, Member Sandstead. I think that's a really important detail that maybe isn't teased out, and it seems to me like it's a little bit out of the spirit of the resolution that we passed, but I guess maybe we can chat about that a little bit later. One of the questions I have, and I think it dovetails nicely off of what Member Sandstead asked, and this being my first budget cycle with this school district. So when we think about the restricted dollars, I know that those will be coming in later on into the picture, but it's really hard, and I understand that we're accepting a preliminary budget today, and it'll help to focus the efforts of the finance staff that has been working very hard. Just from a timing standpoint, when can we anticipate to see those numbers so we can factor them into the larger discussion?
Oh, sorry. We both hit the button at the same time. The allocation sheets will follow this. I guess I have a clarifying question too. When we talk about restricted funds, that can be a lot of different things. So when we're talking about title funding or achievement and integration or food service or transportation, those are all restricted funds that the site doesn't necessarily get, say, food service funding or transportation funding because those are district-wide, but they would be included in the final budget packet that you would be getting in June. But those are district level, not site level.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So when I'm looking at this, at both of them, and we've talked about this at the business committee meetings, when we look at both of the options, there's still a lot of money remaining to be identified. And I'm concerned, dovetailing off of what you said, Superintendent Grosseth, if we've been in roughly 20 years of budget cutting, there's only so much more blood to get out of the turnip. And I'm worried, again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm worried that we will at some point start to lean on some funds to help to make that zero, because I do think that it's really important that we have a budget that is neutral, and because I think what we hear over and over again is that folks are really tired of hearing about the budget deficit, and we talked about this last night. So I think we need to have some creative discussions as board members around how we do that in ways that doesn't jeopardize our class sizes, which I think we hear overwhelmingly is one of the top priorities of folks in the community, but certainly also that we adhere to the rules of the compensatory education piece that we passed a couple of months ago. So I guess maybe this is a request since you answered my question, but wanting to make sure that we're not going into the next year with a projected deficit. And so I think continuing to think creatively and from a heavy development standpoint on how we do that, in addition to thinking about growing some reserves, because it's a painful process for taxpayers who continue to see that number in the negative.
I meant to address this earlier when you asked about contingency. The contingency, which is currently about that 300,000 mark, just a couple of years ago was more than double that. And as the board was going through the budget process, was also at that time facing some really difficult decisions, and one of the items that they requested was that contingency be cut in half, and so that was made at that time, and so that's part of the reason that contingency is lower than we'd like to see it. When we consider that it's $300,000 and a $100,000 budget, that's less than 0.5% wiggle room, as you called it earlier. I think any organization, when they're looking at their budget, if they're looking at a variance between revenues and expenditures, I think 1 to 2% is not too much room. And so it is a concern to us as well that there isn't more contingency built into the budget. Also that this budget does make a very meager addition to the reserves, but it is not as far as we'd like to see it either.
Member Lofald.
So I'm going to work off of page 4, and that's our projected enrollment. And I'm going to, it looks like we are projecting 1,000 less students. If our 7735 is what you project for, no? Am I wrong? Oh, okay. What am I not seeing?
I'm sorry.
On page 4.
This does not include residentials or preschools.
Okay. But still, I was going to look at that and say, you're really low analyzing how many students we have. But I'm still going to tell you that I'm not a favor of conservatism. I think sometimes we are too conservative and we panic and we send out this message that class sizes are going to be big and that we have to, really, and it sends kind of a panic message that we're always in a budget deficit. I'm not saying we're not in a budget deficit, but I'm also saying that when we analyze low or conservative, we send out a strong message that we, and I just think it's, in a way, we all are, the numbers change all the time. I'm just shocked at how much we can just gain in about a week. So there's a part of me that says we, by managing conservative, we are then reactive and we cut things that and it's almost always in FTEs. So when we project, what school enrollment is going to be, and Superintendent Gronseth assigns FTEs to our schools, that is so hard for schools to change, because we then are, and our schools, if we stay too conservative on what we think our enrollment is going to be, and then we set our FTEs towards that, class sizes will be higher, and it will be a scramble, and we'll already have projected to our parents that our class sizes are too high, and they'll pull away from us. So where is the balance between being fiscally responsible and then and I know that CFOs by nature I'm not being disrespectful, Doug, but I know that you're conservative, and I'm saying I'm not. And I think we can be a little bit more aggressive on what we want to say is conservative in our projections for enrollment, and see if that doesn't open up FTEs for our schools. And I don't know. I want to challenge that a little bit.
I don't want to school you. That is certainly not my intent.
But I also want to be open in just other things we could do.
I just want to say that our enrollment projections, if we look at the past 10 years, our district-wide enrollment projections have been within 10 students of what we actually end up with at the end of the year. And so those projections, it's based on trends over time, and they all have regression formulas attached to them. So I think that this year's is probably one of the more conservative ones, because we had a year of growth this year. We took a lot of care. Doug and Peggy, I know, spent many hours with Ms. Little, and we even brought Bill Hansen back and asked how he got so close over so many years. And so a lot of time has gone into these, and we're pretty confident that these are going to be really close to where we end up. Conservative side, to me, means like within 10 students.
Member Liffelkamp.
Let's get back to class sizes some more, and thank you, Member Lofold, for bringing up class sizes. One of the pieces of information I asked for was just what the current class sizes were at our elementary schools, because I felt that we needed to really, particularly with our new board members, have a good sense of what the numbers are looking like right now. And it's concerning to me when I look at, and I'm just looking at our elementary schools right now. I didn't get those numbers for our high schools and our middle schools, but when some of our elementary schools have class sizes of, for kindergarten, for example, for 21, and some have class sizes for 31 at the kindergarten level. And so I'm just trying to understand what it's going to look like to look at the class sizes and allow funds to be used to increase FTEs. How is that going to play out at our schools? How is it going to play out after kindergarten roundup? How is it going to play out at the high schools, just so we understand that?
I thought that might be asked, and so I do have some information that's coming around. Melinda, I do have a few extras if there's people who are looking for those. This is, when we received the question yesterday, this is just the elementary staffing summary. I'm looking at the front page of it here. The first column is the current class enrollment. That's how many there are now. The column next to it is how many teachers, how many FTEs there would be using the current ratio, the average class size that would be determined is that next column. The one that says current sections from all funding sources. This means that some of these sites have used other sources to lower their class sizes. And that is how many sections there are. So if you look at allocation by ratio for Congdon, 22, current sections from all funding sources, 22, you can see there wasn't a difference there. If you go down to, say...
Lakewood's pretty straightforward.
Yep, Lakewood, they received 8 by allocation. They currently have 9. That is because the district has consistently invested a little bit more because of the what we call awkward numbers. If there's a difficult number to split, sometimes we have to add FTEs to make sure that class sizes are reasonable. If you look at, say, Piedmont, by ratio, they'd get 18 teachers. They buy 2 FTEs with other discretionary funds to bring their average class sizes down. So for Piedmont, that average class size went from 26.6 to 23.95. The next column is if there were a ratio shift of 1, how many teachers would be allocated to that site using the 18-19 projected numbers, which is 2 columns over. So Congdon is currently 610 students. Their projected numbers 624 students. They currently have 22 teachers. If there was a ratio shift, they would still receive 22 teachers. If there was a ratio shift of 1.5, they would still receive 22 teachers. There are some fractional pieces there. We would usually be rounding those, but you notice they have 14 more students, but would have the same number of teachers for that. What is at the end there is what their average class size would be if there was a ratio shift of 1.5. Now I have to say that we need to remember that the ratio is different for K, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that wouldn't spread evenly. So K1 would be lower than that, 3, 4, 5 would be higher than that, but that would be the averages, and you can see that the averages are pretty constant across the district. The second page kind of drills into this a little bit more and speaks to that difference between levels. If you take the district as a whole, we have 654 kindergarten students and 28 sections across the district, which means the average class size comes out to be about 23 at the kindergarten level. And you can see across this chart that it slowly goes up. You see there is one split at 32. That is kind of the outlier on the page. But those are the averages if you look at us as a district as a whole. The note that I have in the corner there, this does include sections that if sites use discretionary funds to buy FTEs, that's counted in here. So this is just our current average class sizes across the district as a whole. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you, Doug and team, for bringing that information together on a quick turnaround.
Member Trinka.
I have 3 questions, and I think that these are probably geared towards go ahead. Do you want to follow up?
I forgot to speak to the immersion numbers that are there. The Spanish immersion and Ojibwe immersion, they're maybe 2/3 down that column. Keep in mind that Spanish immersion right now is only kindergarten and first grade. Mm-hmm. And so those averages are going to be lower because we're looking at kindergarten and first grade. the Ojibwe immersion, we recognize that those lowers are that those numbers are lower, but also recognize that they're lower for a purpose, and that the purpose of this program is very purposefully focused on culture and language revitalization, and we know that there was going to be some additional investment in that program. So that is why those numbers are lower.
So just a quick follow-up on that before I get to my other questions. So then are those two, the Spanish immersion and the Ojibwe immersion, are those included in the math for the grand total? And if so, that's skewing the data pretty significantly.
Yep, you're right. And we have another version of this. They're included in the Lowell number. The 100 or 136 students there are in that 411. Mm-hmm. No, we took them out, didn't we, in the formula? Can you speak to that? We did take them out.
No, they're part of the 411, but we did take them out of
The total.
Calculations at the bottom.
Yep.
You did,
That's
for the
what I
Spanish
meant.
and the Ojibwe immersion?
Yes.
Okay, of course you did, thank you. Great, thank you. So I have a few questions as it regards to compensatory education dollars, because our new resolution is new for all of us, and so I just want to make sure that we're clearly communicating what our intentions are. So the first question that I have, and I don't know if you want me to just give them all to you, Superintendent. So the first question is around the budgetary process, and I think it's important information for people to know how the sites are intending to budget for their reallocation of compensatory education, or their new allocation, I guess I should say, of compensatory education dollars. So I think that's an important piece to discuss. The second is ensuring that money is essentially untouchable for other potential district budget shortfalls. So ensuring that if the money is guaranteed to those schools for those programs, that it's kept that way. And then my third question is in regards to option C, and wondering if that would in fact require a new vote, because I know it just seems different enough to me in the way that it's written, and I know that you explained this a little bit earlier, but if you look at the 70 plus 10, I just want to make sure that we're covered on that front, because that would require some additional conversation.
I forgot the first question. No, the first question.
The process for how the sites intend.
Oh, thank you. Yes. We have redesigned our continuous improvement plans for each school. Each month you've heard about the plans that each site has created with their goals. Next year's plans include a piece that is very specific to responding to the comprehensive needs assessment done for the building. So they're identifying a need that was brought forth, how they're going to address that need, and how they're going to pay for it, and how they're going to measure that. So if we're saying we are going to increase our reading scores, and we're going to hire an interventionist, and we are going to use our compensatory funds, and we are going to look at our MCA scores as a measurement for that. Each building will then need to be developing a plan for how they plan to use their discretionary funds, whether it's compensatory education, or it's part of their title plan, or part of the achievement and integration plan. There will be a plan in place that is developed by the continuous improvement team and the principal, which is part of the continuous improvement team for each of those sites. The second piece, there is 80% of comp ed funds spent at each site on both of these options. That is because when we say that we are taking 20% for district-wide, that school is also getting a portion of those funds. So some portion of that 20%, they're getting back because it's then given back on a per student basis. So, for example, Denfeld, 20% of what they generate is $147,000. What they get back on a per student basis is $117,000. So that 20% is, the whole thing isn't leaving the site. What's leaving the site is about the difference of $30,000 there. So when you take 70% of what they generate as discretionary, they are also receiving part of that 20% back, and they're also receiving part of that 10% back. Because some of that is, 10% is going to change the ratio, but it also changes their ratio. So they're getting more staff because of it. So it's not that the whole, if you looked at that 20% and that 10%, it's not that all of that leaves the site. Some of it stays at the site. So that's why option C also meets the language of the resolution. Oh, I'm sorry.
Does it need
turn
a
our
vote?
mic on?
So my question is, how do we ensure that the money is safe? So how do we ensure that if we're going to make the decision that's allocated that way, that we don't, come December, if we're recognizing some deficits, we don't target those dollars as a way to make up the deficit?
I think the language of your resolution does that.
Okay.
Member Lowell.
I want to go back to class size, and I think some of the questions I have also are just around trust, and I'm really hoping we can build trust between all of us, between our leadership, between our community. So, because when you average the class size, for some that seems disingenuous. So we have these average class sizes that would make us predominantly feel better about our budget, because these are not really realistic in a way. When you're a fourth grade parent bringing your child to Congdon and the average says that we're at 27, but I'm enrolling and it's really at 33 because we average, that causes distrust in our community because we're not being honest. So my suggestion, and it might be throwing the whole budget right out tonight too, because it's going to make you have to go back and make some incredibly bigger cuts, but what if we capped? What if we made a resolution that capped our class sizes? I mean, we do have some class size mandates. Yeah, we do. I saw it in some place where you had this. What is that? These are like in K it's not going to go above 24.4. Aren't those caps?
No.
Okay, those are general. So, and I might not be demanding that we do it in this fiscal budget, but we can make a resolution that says in 2020 or 2019 or whatever the next budget is, if we can't manage, but what if we made a resolution that capped our grade levels, and when the caps went over, teachers would then go to their union and grieve it because we're not following our board-directed resolution. It's almost like what Member Sandstead said very, very, very early, way back in January, about what we value, and then building the budget, and like really building the budget from zero. So we've got the comp ed, and then we've got the cap on the class size. And then, whatever that deficit is, then we have to start cutting. And that's where, I know that maintenance would be severe. All of these things that we thought we were going to be able to give a little bit more money to, we really aren't. Because if we value our families and our teachers and getting their trust back, and I'm kind of the one that would say, let's be that severe for a few years so that we're building some trust and we're really saying that we think of our kids first and our teachers, and then we'd get kids back and we'd be able to grow our enrollment. I don't know.
Yeah, please.
You may.
You know, as a teacher at heart and an elementary teacher at heart, I can appreciate your focus on class size. And I also know that class size caps are very difficult for school districts to navigate. And we have seen school districts have tens of millions of dollars in deficit because of caps. For this reason, say you have a school with 2 sections of second grade and your cap is at 24. So you have a class of 24 and a class of 24, and the 25th student then enters a classroom, and under that model you now have to have 3 classes and class size goes down to 16. In that financial model, we would need to invest millions of dollars just at the elementary level. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be it'd be a great thing, but it would not be financially feasible for us at this point without identifying millions in additional revenue.
Do you have a follow-up? Okay. Member Sandsted.
I appreciate your thoughts, Member Lowell, and I know. And I think that maybe, I think that rather than if we talk about it as a cap, as a vision or a goal, or we can set expectations that we hope to meet, but understand that sometimes the reality is tricky, like when you have 1 class per building or things like that, where you get some variation. I had my light on for a narrow question back on your handout, Superintendent. On the first page, the last column, the average class size with the ratio 1.5 shift, on the first page there?
Yes.
Is that only general ed fund, presuming no other funding sources are incorporated?
That is correct.
Okay. That's what I thought. Just wanted to clarify.
Right. And then in these new models, all sites would have some level of discretionary funding.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes.
Okay. So that is something that I hadn't realized. That's okay. So you just said that in the new model, all sites will have some discretionary funding because each site will keep 80% of its comp ed. Is that correct? Or are we talking other discretionary?
Nope. So in model A2, each site would have 80% as discretionary. In option C, each site would have 70% as discretionary.
So if we look at the last column of the average class size ratio 1.5, that would be the figure before adding in Title I, the 80% of comp ed discretionary funds each site would have, and any other discretionary funding. So this would be essentially the minimum that each site could move up depending on how they decide to best spend their dollars individually.
That's true.
Thank you.
In Model A2.
Yes.
Model C would be 70%.
Member Oswald.
Thank you, Chair Kirby. The arguments I heard about option C is in regards to the spirit of the resolution that we have passed, which the resolution that we passed simply says that each of the 13 traditional school sites will receive at least 80% of the compensatory education revenue. That's what we passed, and both options meet that. For me, option C costs less money overall. We have much less of a deficit to deal with because it costs about $550,000 less. We don't have to make as many cuts. That's important. We increase minimum FTEs for everyone in the district and allows buildings to spend their discretionary money more on their focused efforts to help their students meet their basic needs. Whereas if they have less FTE, they may use more of their money to cover staff rather than targeted assisted programs that are meant to help and assist their basic learners catch up. So those are all pros to me, and those are still why I'm still kind of convinced option C is the best. I don't know that anybody vehemently disagrees with me or not, but that's kind of where I stand. My mind hasn't really been changed, and I respect if no one should want to agree with me or not, but that's just where I am. So,
Member Sandstedt.
Yeah, I'm going to respectfully disagree with Member Oswald in that you said there's a difference in cost, but there is no difference in cost between these two options. The only difference is how we're allocating them.
Total adjustments.
I'm getting agreement. Nope. The amount of money that we're, I don't want to say playing with because that is a horrible way to put it, but the amount of money that we're manipulating here is the same in both options. It's just whether or not we are unequally distributing the general funds by building in option C, or if we are equally distributing the general fund money and then laying the additional funds on top in terms of compensatory education, Title I, et cetera, et cetera. I strongly support going with version A2. I am seeing things that, in fact, don't make me alarmed about class sizes. In fact, I think show that with some variation depending on site and class population, we're not in bad shape in terms of class sizes, and option A2 would not greatly increase class sizes, and in fact, next October, when we look at what the actual class size results are, depending on how buildings allocate their discretionary funds, the class sizes may be lower than they currently are. But that is leaving it up to the sites. And that's what I really like about option A2, is that it says, hey, CIT teams, you guys are the experts. You know your students, you know your families, you know how to best use these funds, whether it's class size, whether it's interventionists, whether it's some other special programming, in order to serve our students best and to lift up those students who are underperforming right now. And so I see this as a choice between an equal distribution of general funds, which should be equally distributed, at least that's what we're talking about at this point, and a choice between allowing the staff at our sites to have the freedom to do with these funds what they think is best for our students. So that's why I'm going to be supporting option A2 as our preliminary budget.
Member Trinka.
I have a question about that as well, dovetailing off of, that's the third time I've used that word tonight, I'm sorry, off of what Member Oswald said. So just basic math here. I'm seeing a difference between A2 and option C as around $518,363. Can you explain that please?
I may have to lean on Ms. Blaylock and Mr. Hassler a bit, but the difference is because it requires more general fund to fund the ratio in one model than the other. So if you look at in these models, comp ed and general fund together, the whole budget as it were, all the revenues are all the revenues, and it truly is which category they are being used in.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I think I really appreciate the feedback from all of my colleagues that, and I think, as we've discussed at business committee meetings, we really all have the same foundational values, and we do value all of our families across the district, and we have the same foundational values which we heard in January, that we all believe that these compensatory education dollars should be allocated at least 80% at the site where they're generated. We're also really dedicated to smaller class sizes, and also being budget neutral. Well, maybe not everyone is, but I certainly am. And I think finding ways as we move forward through this budget process, regardless of what the decision is made tonight, that we maintain those in the back of our minds, and we also think about ways to learn from this as we move forward, and that, not that you haven't been doing that for a long time too, but I think that this is just a testament to how complicated all of this is. But because it's very complicated, I don't want the message to get lost about what our values are as school board members. It's just that, unfortunately, because the reimbursement from the state and from the feds not only hasn't caught up with even just basic inflation increases, let alone all of the additional students who we're seeing who require special services, that it just really solidifies how we need to be much more proactive and stronger advocates for those folks who are making the decisions at the state and the federal level around how they reimburse us. And so we might have to charge the hill again as a whole community sometime in the coming months and years, because this is not we know this isn't a sustainable model. It's not sustaining itself now. What I would, again, and this will be the last time I say this maybe tonight, is that I'm not going to say dovetail again right now, is around budget neutrality. I think it sends a really bad message to our students as we're teaching them basic budget skills, that we can go into a deficit, but they can't. Their checking accounts don't allow them to, they still have checking accounts. They don't allow them to do that. And so that's a piece that I will continue to push for, especially, and I get that it's a delicate dance between our priorities and what we can fund. But I don't think that we can continue to, it's not sustainable for us to be running deficits like that.
Member Lofall?
So I'd like to just talk about two other areas where I'd like to challenge our decision, and that is in test proctors for assessment and in maintenance. I'd like just a little clarification on maintenance and what that 50,000 is about. I know we've seen earlier where you're going to change the cleaning schedule from once every other day to once every third day, and how does that actually save us money when I would think that the custodial and then the elimination of some open positions, $50,000. What is those positions? Not the plumber. Are we going to have a plumber we're not? Oh, okay. Let me know. And then, just speaking to the assessment, I worry about the MCA rollout, and if is our plan then, if we don't have test proctors, that we're going to have the teachers administer? And I just think that gets into some ethical issues, and putting our teachers in, I think, a kind of tough scenario. I might have to recuse myself, because I'm currently right now a test proctor. And so I know the training I've had, and I know the setup, and I know the time intensity of getting the sites ready for MCA. And I don't think that's something that the teachers will you're going to have to pay for subs to get them trained. I just don't see how that's viable of a savings. So I would challenge those two areas, maintenance, $50,000 can't, we can find some other cuts, I don't know, and the proctors.
I'll address the maintenance first. That is, to clarify, from the prior options included changing cleaning schedules and such. This does not include that. So it's a significant difference in the amount that we're looking at. This is one position, and happens to be the plumber position that you mentioned, that has gone unfilled. We felt that was one area that we could do contracted services. Okay. There's not as much maybe preventative work with our plumbing. It usually is in response to something like a pipe bursting, or this week it was a toilet falling off the wall. But being able to address that, so that in both of these options, the cleaning schedule wouldn't change. Those positions would have called for a significant decrease in our maintenance staff. It no longer calls for that. The test proctors, that was an investment that we made a couple of years ago. This does not represent all of the test proctors, and I am failing to remember which levels it is, and I know Dr. Lake isn't here this evening. I believe it kept the test proctors in place at the no levels.
Okay.
I know that the whole amount was $60,000 for all of the test proctors, so I know it's not all of them. And I wish I could speak more to that,
okay.
But
I can ask Dr. Lake as well then.
I know.
After going through the process, I'm sure she would agree that sometimes I think on the makeup days or something where we have fewer kids testing might be an opportunity to scale back hours of our test proctors. So it would give us some savings. But I'm glad to hear that it's not the whole program. And that was probably, I should have phrased that question better, is that, there's some supervisory, there's some leadership in our community of retired teachers that are getting it all set up. And if that still stays, I could see where teachers could be the more monitors. So, thank you.
Can I follow up? I know that there is at least one site this year that is piloting, and I know that they're using Chromebooks in their classrooms, and the teachers are proctoring that, and so I know they're working on some transition, some practice for next year.
Member Lefebvre-Kemp?
Yes. Have we heard back from our insurance company about the PEEP information?
Good question.
Tomorrow? Okay.
It'd be tomorrow at 10
Okay.
o'clock.
Okay.
So that's potentially more money.
Do you want to, Doug, just for the purposes of people understanding what PEEP is and just how it could play into the budget or not?
I'd be happy to. As a participant, as an employer participating in PEEP, we are joining up with other school districts and I think other public entities around the state. It's all built around the state employee insurance benefit program. The experience in terms of claims experience that all the participants have are effectively pooled. Now, I would distinguish that we're not pooled with state employees, but as a school district that's in, other school districts are all part of that process. We've had we've had generally good experience with our year-to-year premium renewals. My projection at the start of this process was a 6% increase, which is in my opinion, a pretty reasonable one from the standpoint of what the larger insurance market is expected to produce this year. Last year's increase for PEEP for us was about a 2.8% increase. The year before that was 6.8 or 6.9. The years prior to that were typically less than 6. We have already built in some anticipated cost savings in terms of these documents that you're looking at. It'd be great if it were a real lowball number to be even lesser than what we might hope. But we are on a July through June plan year, so that means that the rates that we will find out tomorrow will become effective for our premium payments beginning in the month of July, so it tracks with our budget year. There are some number of school districts that participate in PEEP that have a January through December plan year. And I don't know if that's answering the questions you have.
Thank you. Member Oswald.
I'm just having a hard time understanding how we've had much discussion about valuing class size and how we want to maintain low class sizes in elementary schools especially. And yet our budgets contain items such as removing the secondary or the middle school allocation and levy money and that sort of thing. So I'm really hard pressed as to why we can talk about valuing class size and yet we're going to choose to make a decision to raise the class sizes or the class size ratio raise class sizes via the class size ratio. And that really doesn't make any sense to me. And so I would really hope that people think about that.
Member Trinka.
CFO Hasser, I'm assuming that we'll have those PEEP updates at the next business committee meeting, correct? And see how that factors in from a financial standpoint. I have a process question on the resolution. I know we're not here yet, but I want to make sure I ask it before I forget. Periodic updates is a really squishy term, and I don't know that we necessarily need to hardwire it, but I know we've been getting updates at least every other week, and I want to make sure that's continuing as we move through until June. I know it's a lot of work for all of us and a lot of pages for other people to read, but I think it's important that we stay on top of that for a variety of reasons. Commenting on Member Oswald's question, I think Member Sandstead made a clarification earlier that we actually are anticipating that class sizes would go down potentially depending on how sites decide to use their money in the options. Did I misunderstand that? That's correct. Yeah.
I haven't said anything, so I'm going to say something first. We've been talking about elementary schools, and we haven't talked about middle schools and high schools. And the allocation will affect them as well. And I talked with, it was an East High School teacher this past weekend, and he teaches a required course, and I asked, how many do you have in your class? He had 42 in each of his 4 classes. And I said, what about this year? Oh, it's down to 35. But he said, if I give a 2-page paper to each of those 35 kids in each of those classes, he said, it is an incredible amount of work. And that's not sustainable, he said, for what he does. So I think we need to look at that. And the average class size ratios don't really tell you, and I'm not sure how to get at this, what actually a teacher has in front of them in a class. It varies by site and it varies by other things. And I appreciate Member Sandsted's comment, but not all schools have extra funds to bring their class sizes down. That's the whole point of this. Some schools don't have that. And one of the things that, well, I have mentioned this before, I think, that was brought up when we were at the state legislature, and school safety is a big issue, and this teacher at East brought this up as well. You cannot get relationships with kids with 35 in a class when you've got 3 or 4 or 5 classes. You can't do it. And someone at the legislature said, who is the counselor that refers to the school counselor? It's the teacher. And if you're not developing relationships, knowing names, you can't do that. And so it's incredibly important, I think, to look at class size in terms of safety, as that is a big issue these days. Locking doors is one thing, but knowing your kids is another. And I think that we need to really take this into account. Maybe especially in high schools and middle schools, we haven't talked about this at all. I would have another question for the superintendent, however. How does this preliminary budget relate to our final budget in June?
I think the most important piece of this preliminary budget is the piece that is related to the staffing ratio. That is because that's tied to all of our HR functions that we hope to start very soon. And that is the cycle of identifying how many teachers are at each site, and then displacements and posting positions, and none of that can start until we know what the teacher-student ratio is going to be.
Thank you. Member Loeffler-Kemp.
On page 8 and also on option C with staffing comparisons for the high schools, does that include the counselors in that ratio?
Mr. Hassler?
Yes, it does. That's the way we've allocated that staffing in the past.
Was there any kind of conversation to reconsider that by administration?
That could be a possibility. However, that becomes an investment on the investment side, and so we would have to then identify reductions in a like amount.
Member Luffold.
Well, to follow up with Member Loeffler-Kemp, that has always been a source of irritation with allotting FTEs at the high school and middle school level, is that we count our counselors in our class size average or in our FTEs. So when you give Denfeld 31.7 FTEs, does 3 of them automatically go to the counselors?
2.
And then, so if you're given 31.7.
At the secondary level, it's 2 counselors and 1 media position is included in the ratios.
As teachers?
Yes.
So, okay. Can we change that? 31 has to be 31 teachers that have class sizes of 30. That just skews. Again, that's where the mistrust in our communities and between us and our staff happen. And if they've asked us to change it, we should change it. And I know that's going to make some changes in how we do our budget, but here we are in our budget process. So we have to at least be looking at that. And so how does that move forward as a board? If we decide that we will direct our administration to not include the counselors and the media specialist, can we ask that be looked at and put into another option for a budget? What would that look like? Because it's just not realistic to count our counselors in those FTEs.
To make that change, we would need to identify another $1,152,000 in reductions.
He always has a way of like bringing me home again. But I mean, then don't list them out as FTEs so that our community really does see that in actuality we have 27 teachers teaching English, math. I don't want to disingenuous my counselors and my media specialists. They are vital to our success. But when we put them and wrap them into the FTE allocations, and then we also then average our class size on that, I feel that is deceiving of in our community when we want to really be open and transparent, and we have all those little things that's always been done. And I'm just saying let's just open it up and call it what it is. So Denfeld gets 31.7, or they get 27.7, and then there's another column that says they get 2.0 counseling and they get 1.0 media specialist. And then maybe, I don't know, I mean, maybe our schools then will decide, I don't know, what they want to do with allotting that. What other positions are in our middle schools and our high schools that are also wrapped into FTEs? Because FTEs to me sound like we have 33 teachers, and they're teaching English and math and science and industrial and all of those other courses that have seats there. I know it might, yeah.
Superintendent?
I can tell you that at the elementary level, it is like you're recommending, and we made that change a few years back. The ratio at the elementary level used to include the specialist positions, so music, phy-ed, art, and media. And what we did is it didn't have an effect on the ratio, but we changed how we reported that out. So the ratio number did change, although it didn't change. Well, it didn't change what was happening. They were still getting those specialists, and the teachers were still allocated, but those two processes were separate. We could do something similar at the high school, where we take, if we say as a base, every school gets this core staff, and this core staff includes 2 counselors and a media specialist. Administration is a different piece of that. We have said that every secondary gets a principal, every secondary gets an assistant principal. Some choose to use some of their FTE or some of their funding to have a dean or a second. No, we fund a dean. That's right. But if they choose to have 2 assistants, then discretionary is used between the 2. We could say every site also gets 2 counselors and a media specialist, and then adjust that ratio number. It wouldn't have an effect on how many teachers are going to that site, but it would be more clear, as you say, more transparent as far as saying, all right, this number really means this is a staffing allocation. That doesn't necessarily mean, however, that a site always chooses to use those FTEs as teachers. Sometimes they may use those FTEs as a social worker or an interventionist, or so there's other things that are affecting that class size that a site is choosing to make decisions with.
Member Sandsted.
I like that. I like more transparency. So I would encourage administration to make that change. I'm going to make a motion to amend the resolution that we are discussing to to specify that we are approving the preliminary budget report for the fiscal year 2019 as presented to the school board in option A2 be adopted.
Is there a second for that? Second. Seconded by Member Lofald. Is there any discussion on this? Member Oswald.
Just a question, I guess, on how this vote goes. If this fails, do we have to do a second vote for C, or is it assumed that C is what we go with?
Probably have to do, I would think the second one, just to be clear.
Is there any other discussion? I will be voting against this. I think we're between a rock and a hard place, but I think that the other option C would allow schools to have more, certain schools at least, to have more, have fewer potential cuts in their staff. And I think that's very important. So I will be voting against that. Is there any other discussion? Seeing none then. Member Lofald. I'm sorry.
Well, just again, I think I want to give a vote. I think either option is still just going to lead us down to doing what the administration needs to do, and that is, make some preliminary. Wouldn't I be right to say that whatever option we have, there's still a lot of tweaking and things that we need to address. This gives you direction as to staffing for a big part of it, I would think. Because the thing that still is so out there with no matter what one, and I think option A2 has a better overall equity in it, because the unknown to all of us is that the comp ed monies given back to all of our buildings, and then the extra 20% reallocated is going to allow schools, I would think, to use it to keep class sizes down. And then again, as we go to our April workshop and start visioning for 4 years with other options for maintaining strong schools and healthy class sizes and incredible staff and teachers, that we will get there. We're still projecting revenues, we're still projecting enrollments, and so I think that there's a lot still not known. And I do believe that we will continue to work towards strong presence on our east end of town, where we know funds are being, diminished. But we're going to work towards visiting and communicating and encouraging and knowing that we're going to get there. It might not be next fall as we work through a big change with Comp Ed, but our vision is, I hope they'll give us some wiggle room for 1 year, because I believe that we will have some strong referendum movements. I do. I think we will we are already seen as a more proactive and strong board and a united board. I believe we're going to bring people back to our district with this kind of opportunities and discussions. And so again, I think we will see that our eastern schools will not see the incredible bump in enrollment that we might think. I think we're going to work hard not to see that happen. I don't know how, but we will.
Member Lefferkamp.
She asked a question.
Who?
Okay, go ahead.
Jill asked a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jill. Member Lofeld.
No.
Oh.
She asked.
Superintendent.
Oh, she asked you a question.
Yeah, in the beginning there was a question about the budgets and the preliminary budgets, and I just want to clarify that they will continue to be developed. You know, as we get closer to the end of the year, our revenues and expenditures become more and more clear, and our expenditures for next year become more clear. A piece that we would not be changing after this
Is the class ratio.
the ratio piece, because once we start down the road of beginning all that staffing, if we make a change to that, we have to put everything back where it was and start over again as far as staffing moves. And so we would really hope to keep that as a constant and use other areas as variables. Yeah.
Member Oswald?
The comment keeps being made that all the schools will be able to lower their class sizes with their discretionary funds should they choose, but we must remember that not every school is receiving a large amount of funds with our reallocation, and they aren't going to be able to focus money entirely on how are they going to achieve helping their basic skill learners move. And if they use it all up in an extra 0.4 FTE to create that one more class, then they don't have anything to use to help their basic learners. And that is the dilemma that I cannot accept. And knowing that this vote sets the class size ratio will mean that East gets 2.7 less teachers and Denville gets 1.8 less teachers in that ratio. That's what it is, and that's what I find unacceptable.
Member Leffler-Kemp.
I am in agreement with you, Member Oswald. I am not happy with the impact on our staff across the district, but the impact on our staff in schools on the East End. And so I want people to be very clear, and I feel like we've talked about a lot of things tonight, particularly on the staffing ratios, the difference between option A.2 and option C, just to be sure that people understand the impact. So we're clear on that. So I'd like you to just kind of review that again.
Superintendent.
All right, if I were to summarize as clearly as I can, if you look at option A2, sites receive higher amounts of discretionary funding and fewer FTEs. That doesn't affect all buildings equally as far as effect on the FTEs. So there would be sites who receive fewer FTEs, but all sites receive more discretionary. Keeping in mind the difference, if you can see the difference in discretionaries on pages 8 and 12 between the two plans. The discretionary comp ed amounts are listed in that column. I would also note that these, when I say discretionary comp ed, that's only that source. Some of these sources would also receive Title I funding and Achievement and Integration funding, or ESL funding, or Gifted and Talented funding, all the other different sources that would aid them in those sites. In option C, there's less discretionary funding for each site, but higher FTE levels for all sites. Is that pretty clear? Adjusting the ratio by 0.5, right. Option C applies some of the comp ed to cover the ratio at each building so that general fund can provide funding across the district for that same purpose.
Member Trinka.
Thank you. I think you guys are probably tired of my voice tonight. I totally agree with all my colleagues that we can't, that less teachers is something that we can't accept. I do, however, I think unfortunately, and I said this in January too, we're pitting this source of funding that was created at the state legislature for a certain reason against class sizes. And it's an emotionally loaded discussion that doesn't need to be loaded the way that it is. We absolutely need to reduce our class sizes. We absolutely need to increase our number of FTE. But the state designated this amount of money for certain resources. And again, as I said earlier, I know it sounds Pollyanna, but we do need to be talking with our legislatures more and more about this. But because of the conversations we've had leading up to this, and recognizing that certainly none of us want we want to have more teachers, but I think given what the dollars are allocated for, I will be in support of Member Sandsted's motion.
Member Gorham.
I've had a difficult time coming to a conclusion. However, I believe I'm at a point where I know where I'm going to go, and I'm leaning towards option C. The reasons for that are as such. I think Member Trinka did an outstanding job kind of talking about our board and the values that we have, and this is a difficult decision. But I think at the end of the day, when we look at compensatory education funds, they're generated by certain students, and those students reside in all buildings across our district, and unfortunately so in much greater numbers building by building. However, that does not mean that they do not exist at Lester Park, at Congdon, and my feeling with option C is that although it reduces the discretionary funds, it does provide added FTE. If you look at Homecroft, if you look at the comp ed fund totals for Homecroft, I believe it is, and perhaps Lakewood, there's not enough total comp ed money there to hire even one staff person. And so my question would be, with that allocated amount of money, how would you address the needs of those students who do attend school there, who we are accountable to? That would be my question, my thought of why I lean towards option C, because I have not heard interventions for these students that do not include staff time. Option C gives us a better chance to address those needs.
Member Sandstead.
Thank you, Chair Kirby.
Yep.
There's been a lot of discussion about class size and framing this. What this comes down to for me is a choice between taking compensatory education out of the equation here to say that is money that we're setting aside to be spent at the buildings that it's generated on students who are underperforming. Focusing instead just on the remaining general ed funds and saying option A2, we're going to distribute those equally. That's state funding. That should go per pupil to each school by the number of kids so that each school can start with the base class size that is equal. That is what option A2 tells you. Option C says, okay, because we're setting aside this comp ed funds, we're going to, in fact, unequally and inequitably distribute the general funds. We're going to take the funds that are intended for all students and we're going to give more of it to some students. And we're giving more of it to the students at the schools that have lower rates of underperforming students. That is the option in front of us this evening. I'm going to be voting in favor.
Oh, Member Lofold.
It is hard. It's so multi-level, but I'm going to support Sandstead, and I think you just laid it out so well that I think we have to understand that our vote for comp ed money in January that we all thought was the value we wanted to share. And now, because we're worried about, some loss in revenue that should have not been there. It's kind of like what our parent talked to us tonight about when she said that we were really giving this money to other schools when it was really supposed to be given to our low-performing students at the buildings they're at. And so we've kind of been giving money to schools that don't generate as much, and now that has kept us from, generating more revenue. And I don't know how that is, if it's asking for more taxes or, we've done that too. This is a part of the whole process here, is that in our community we haven't always been able to get our community to see that our school board is trusted and we're using our monies, and so they don't give us, I don't know if it's a referendum or a levy or a tax, because I haven't. But I think that A2 stays to the true nature of what we did in January. And by going to C, it's because we don't have I know we want to try to, not make it so harsh on some of our buildings that have been getting extra money, but I think the intent of the resolution in January best matches A2, if that's what we want. And now we're just kind of tweaking it because we're nervous about class size.
Member Gorham?
Here's a thought, and if my thought is a question that someone can answer, awesome. If someone can explain to me how we would meet the needs of students at the schools, such as Homecroft, with the amount of money that they're getting, I'd be much more inclined to vote for A2. Is there a way to do that?
Member Oswald.
I respectfully disagree with the interpretations of Member Stanstead and Member Lofald, because I'm not pitting equity versus equality. I'm looking at the individual students that are generating this money as a lump sum of money, regardless of where they live and where their building is, and how to best meet the needs of those learners that are not meeting their basic skills. And giving buildings the best opportunity to create and make programs and situations for success on those kids, or for those kids. That's really what it's about. And I don't see it as an east-west thing. I don't see it as equity versus equality. It's about the kids.
Superintendent? Okay, well.
So to go back to Member Gorham's question about how does the money then help the kids that are generating it and in need. And I look at the community that's out there, and we have some incredibly talented and educational people that could probably answer that question. And that's what I don't like about being up here, is that we don't have all the answers, and some of them out there do. And they're wondering, and I'm trusting that Superintendent Gronseth can answer the question as well, because he's spent his whole career in education as well. From my experience about working with our students in a way that honors and instructionally gives them the opportunity to move up on their skill sets, we have become, through Superintendent Starsecki and other past people that have been in your position, we have trained our staff, especially in the elementary level, they know the targets that their kids need, so that extra money would come in, maybe extra instructional materials. It would come in maybe some pull-out opportunities in staffing. It would come in more, I don't know, I do know that our staff knows how to work with that pot of money. It just means that pot of money does have to go, it probably wouldn't go so much in class size reduction. It would go in specific targeted interventions for students who are underperforming. So if we have 150 students at Congdon that are underperforming, the $163,000 in comp ed that Congdon gets will go specifically probably to those 160. Oh, thank you, Superintendent Stoyce. Come on up. I knew that we would talk long enough that you'd have to come up and clarify.
Just really quick, I'm going to try to answer your question and kind of address what you're saying. Just a reminder that next year we will be accessing the ADSYS grant, which is an alternative delivery service model to be able to provide intervention services in buildings that have not had intervention services before. And that is a direct result of some buildings not having discretionary dollars to hire those interventionists. And so this year Congdon has piloted that and will continue to do that work. Next year Homecroft and Lakewood will also have interventionists that will work under our MTSS model. So all buildings next year will have some sort of interventionist model using data through MTSS.
Thank you, Superintendent.
That is, I was going to speak to MTSS and say that, you know, for the first time, because in prior budgets, only sites that have 50% or higher of their population of students receiving free or reduced price lunch received any discretionary funds. And so this new model does give discretionary funds to all sites. On the A2 model, Homecroft would receive $42,470, knowing that the average cost of a teacher is $96,000. That is somewhere in the range of a 0.4 teacher, which would be, you know, a few hours a day for a teacher to be there, and possibly help with an MTSS model where they're pulling small groups or working one-on-one with students for specific interventions. You know, different sites have different amounts available. A site like Myers-Wilkins will end up with about, well, given all discretionary funds, will have over $1 million. We have heard many times over the course of the year the deep needs felt at some of our buildings. And when I presented these two models, I said option A was a bold choice. It really says that we recognize that we have students who come to our schools with different levels of need and different experiences, and this not only meets the language of the resolution for this year, but takes us to the end of that cycle. I mean, not to the end of the cycle, but we said over the next 4 years it was going to be 85 and then 90 and 95. Option A gets us very close to the 95% to 100% for most of those sites. Option C also meets the language, but only gets us to the 80% mark at some sites. Other sites are in the higher 80s to 90%. So that it's degrees. How far do we go? How soon?
Member Sandsted.
Yeah, to your question, Member Gorham, I also noticed that if you look at the discretionary comp ed in option A2 versus C, there's actually more funds available for Homecroft for these discretionary targeted services to students who are in need than in option C. And so if we're talking about assistance to underperforming students, option A2 does a better job giving the sites the freedom to use those funds, more of those funds, to serve students who are falling behind. But I would note that across the board, sites are getting more discretionary funds than they have in the past next year. Is that correct? All sites will be getting more access to discretionary funds because we're making them discretionary, whereas before they were largely allocated. Is that fair, Superintendent?
Yes, and I would say that the difference is significant. The discretionary amount, if you just look at these two, the discretionary amount on option A2, if you go down to the bottom total, it's $4.4 million. In option C, that discretionary amount is $3.8 million. And currently, our discretionary amount, and I'm going to look over to CFO Hassler, because he's going to remember that number better than I am.
Sorry, thanks.
I'm not going to remember it at all. I'm just going to tell you it's $1,024,247 in FY18.
So from 1.2 million to 3.8 million to 4.4 million.
That's huge.
Member Gorham.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge a difference in discretionary monies available. My concern still exists, though, even though there is more. The difference is about $4 to $6 million. That would be nice.
Yeah, right?
$4,000 to $6,000, which probably doesn't do a whole lot. So I want to make sure I heard Assistant Superintendent Starzaki correctly. We have a grant that will provide interventionists at schools who have traditionally not had them. Is that correct? One interventionist at these schools.
I want to be clear, it may not be an entire FTE or a portion of one. Okay, Lakewood's 0.5. I knew there was a portion in there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Member Gorham.
So one per building, 0.5 at Lakewood. I'm hearing that. Okay. And I had a question. I'm losing it. I think I need dinner. No.
Right?
Yeah.
How many years does this grant go for? How sustainable is it?
It's a 2-year grant. This is the first year. So there's 1 year remaining, and then there is an opportunity to reapply.
Anything else? Is that a question? I was going to say one thing.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say that I think that smaller class sizes benefit the students with free and reduced lunch as well. Even though they may get pull-out services, being in a smaller class would benefit them as well. So I think that we can't say that that doesn't make a difference. So, you'd like to call a question?
Yes.
All in favor of calling the question, say aye. Aye.
Do you need a second on that?
I don't think so. Okay. All right. So the motion before us is the resolution B3183532 with the amendment that
Do you have to vote
option A2 be.
Do you have to vote on the amendment and then the resolution?
Yes.
Well, I'm just saying that's where the
Okay.
amendment is. It's part of that resolution, but we're essentially voting on A2 to be the item in the resolution. So is everybody clear on that? And that was made by Member Sandstedt, seconded by Member Lowfalt. All right. All in favor of that say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. So Member Gorham, Member Oswald, myself, and Member Leffler-Kemp vote nay, so that fails 3-4. So we have then the resolution before us, which our options are option C, or to postpone, definitely postpone for another day, I suppose is another option. But I will, to further things along, I will move that we adopt option C. Seconded by Member Oswald. Is there any? Yes.
Are you amending?
Amending the resolution to it. Okay, you got it. Similar to yours, except. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Seconded by Member Oswald. Any discussion on this? Seeing none, we can then vote. All in favor of adopting option C as a part of this resolution, say aye. 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 Opposed?
Nay.
So that passes 4-3 with Member Lowfall, Sandsted, and Trinka voting no. Then we should probably vote on Resolution B 3/1835-32, which will be forwarded as to the administration as working with option C. Is that clear enough to everyone?
Can I restate it?
Sure, please do. Go ahead.
Just to clarify,
Okay.
so the last vote was to add the amendment to specify option C to the underlying resolution 3532. Now we are voting on the underlying resolution 3532, which now reads we are approving the preliminary budget that is based on option C.
Correct. And that was moved by me, seconded by Member. So you'll second that?
I did it when we started this.
Oh, okay. All right. Any discussion on this? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. 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 Opposed?
Nay.
So it passes.
I went aye.
Okay. Passes 5-2 with members Trinka and Sandsted voting no. All right. That is the end of our agenda, unless someone has some bad. Moved by Member Sandsted, seconded by Member Oswald. Any discussion? Dinner?
Move to dinner.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you very much. It was a good discussion. Yeah.